Thank you. So fantastic stuff there. So getting these kind of different perspectives and different challenges and insights across the piece there. So both from Sarah and from Jane. So thank you very much. So the key question, why does policy coherence matter to women and girls? Why are we looking at this? Why have we chosen to look at this as one of the three key topics that we look at during the lifetime of the Advisory Council? So we have two members of our Advisory Council are going to help us answer that question and set out why this is important and why this topic matters. So I'm delighted that Talat Yaqoob, who's Director of Equate Scotland and the National Expert on Gender Equality in STEM and co-founder and Chair of Women 50/50, the National Campaign for Fair Representation of Women in Politics and on Public Boards, and also Emma Ritch, Executive Director of Engender, Scotland's feminist policy organisation, working on women's social, economic and political equality in Scotland, and Emma active not just in Scotland but across the UK, the EU and the UN to boot. So please welcome Talat and Emma.
Good morning. Lovely to see all your faces today and glad that the trains could finally get you here. So Talat and I are going to do a quick whistle-stop tour of policy coherence, making policy work for women's equality and rights. And Talat is specifically going to focus on the intersectional dimensions of that and what we mean. But essentially, as Sarah has introduced beautifully this morning, what we really are talking about when we're talking about policy coherence is how policy made by government at whatever level works together with other bits of policy. And the bit in brackets is the bit that we're really focusing on this year as a council to advance women's and girls' equality and rights. So we think there are two key challenges in policy coherence as a way of advancing women's and girls' equality and rights. The first one is how we make sure that policymakers think about women and girls at all when they're developing their policy and don't make policy for the mythical, rational economic man who doesn't have care work to do and potentially doesn't have childcare to do and doesn't work part-time and the other features of rational economic man. The second challenge is, once we've got policymakers thinking about women and girls, how do we coordinate that focus on women and girls across all of the policy being made so that policy does not act in tension with itself and pull against itself and in some cases undermine itself? We have constructed this little model of gender-sensitive policy, which is one of the ambitions that we have for policy making, and created these three kind of broad types of gender sensitivity, levels of gender sensitivity. So in the middle, we have the most gender sensitive policy. So that's the policy that best takes account of the lives of women and girls. And in that type of policy, the very foundation, the understanding of the lives of women and girls is so rich that it influences all of the thinking, modelling and analysis of the particular piece of policy. And the example that I've identified as a piece of Scottish government policy that does that really well is violence against women policy, and particularly Equally Safe, which is Scotland's violence against women strategy. In the middle ring, there's policy where not every element of it is infused with a deep understanding of women's equality and rights, but there are substantial and meaningful bits of the policy that do that really well. And that's also usually the product of a good gender-sensitive policy process. And the example that I've used for that is the Child Poverty Action Plan, which is a really well done and creative piece of policy. And on the outer ring, there is policy, and we'll all have seen this, where women and girls may be mentioned, there may be a sincere intention on the part of policymakers to include women and girls' lives and realities, but actually the content of the policy skates really superficially over the reality of what that means. As an example of that, I've described employability policy, and I'm going to talk about that very briefly just now. What would a gender-competent, policy-coherent approach to employability look like in Scotland? If you don't know what employability is, it's this. So factors and processes that enable people to move towards employment, to stay in employment, and to move on in the workplace. And between 2013 and 14 in Scotland, we spent £660 million on employability. And that was across the third sector, funded by the European Union, by UK government, and by Scottish government and local government. So a real patchwork of initiatives and endeavours. Employability is really formulated around the idea of a pipeline. So you enter at one end, very far away from the labour market, you proceed in a fairly linear fashion through a number of stages, and you pop out at the other end in often the first job that can be found for you that is appropriate. And so it's often seen as really quite linear and start at A and finish at E. Hold that thought, because there is a reality that women experience in epidemic levels across Scotland, which is not treated as an epidemic necessarily by all policymakers, but sometimes as a bit of a boutique problem, which is entirely picked up by violence against women policy making, and that is the epidemic levels of domestic abuse that we see in Scotland, common to all states and nations around the world. So at the moment, we know that at least 500,000 women living in Scotland will experience domestic abuse at some point in our lifetimes. And I'm talking about women in this room and known to women and men in this room. That adds up to 20,000 discrete service users for women's aid services every year in Scotland. This is not a small number of people that we're talking about. And critically, this has a profound impact on women's capacity to work and to participate in the formal labour market. Every single woman in refuge, and that's not every single woman who experiences domestic abuse, obviously, will have to stop paid work. Most will lose tenancies, most will have children moving schools, and most will have ongoing civil and criminal proceedings to engage with. So those of us who can imagine those circumstances, or who've lived those circumstances, or who've known people who have, can see what an entirely life-upending experience that type of domestic abuse is. And yet, employability, which is designed to get women from being out of paid work into paid work, is not sensitive to domestic abuse. So what would it look like if those policies were coherent with one another? Well, first of all, employability policy and practice would not have the circumstance it often does, that if you drop out of an employability program, you have to go right back to the beginning. Women who are experiencing domestic abuse describe their personal circumstances as being attached to a bungee cord. They can be going along through life and suddenly they'll have to deal with a court case or appearances at court or traumatized children who need their input over the short term. And so we must have employability services that allow you to go back to where you were when you had to, unfortunately, leave. We also know that a lifetime of poverty comes from just ushering women into the first job that is available, which is often in cleaning, catering, caring, clerical, or retail work. These are jobs which see women live in more poverty than men. So what we want to see from employability is, first of all, any job to let women get their feet under themselves who've experienced domestic abuse, and then to have the skills and support to consider their careers, their long-term economic sustainability and success. And finally, we desperately need employability programs that meet the needs that women have for other things apart from support to find work. And those are things like transport, childcare, advice and engagement that understands that women are often ushered into stereotypical female jobs that are very low paid, and that women's aspirations and ambitions may be broader than those. And also that women may want to start their own businesses. The world of work is still quite inhospitable to women, and starting a business can be a way of balancing care and life. So, a whistle-stop tour of what policy coherence in terms of employability and domestic abuse might look like. Talat.
Thank you, Emma, for that overview. We're doing a bit of a duet here, and I'm very aware of the fact that actually the purpose of these events is for you to do talking and not for us to do as much talking. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour too. I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality and what that actually means. In the examples that Emma's just provided, we can't see women as a homogenous group. 51% of the population are women, but within that we are women of colour, we are disabled women, we are unpaid carers, we are have caring responsibilities, we are LGBT, our first language might not be English. Women make up a very diverse set of people within Scotland, and as such we have to respect policy making in an intersectional way. If we were to look at domestic abuse policy, if we were to look at employability services, do they consider women as a non-homogenous group? Are they thinking about the needs of women who are coming in, who require more than what is invested in currently? Okay. Are we making presumptions about where they are at and what access to opportunity they have? So I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality, and although that is something that we are discussing in detail in year 3 as a council, it has to make up everything we talk about all of the time. Year 3 allows us to focus in on it and talk about whether we are meeting those needs, but every decision we take as a council, if it's not intersectional, it's not feminist. If it's not feminist, it's not working. That's the way that I see it. So for some of you, the word intersectionality might be part of your lexicon, but for some of you, it might not be. Now, in the past few years, it has certainly become part of Scottish policy making and conversations around campaigning, but that's only in the last few years, and talking about it is good, doing something about it is better, and that's where we're looking to get to. So whilst it's become part of the language that we use, what does it actually mean? Well, this was formatted better when it was on my laptop, so sorry about that. But what does it actually mean? It's a term that was introduced first by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a feminist academic in the States. If you've not heard her speak, if you have not read her books, do that. It is a gift. She used the term firstly in 1989 in her paper Demarginalising the Intersection of Race and Sex. What she was primarily talking about was the experience of African American women, black women, and the systems and oppressions that they are facing within the States. The intersection of sexism and racism is what she was talking about. You can face both of those things at the same time. I stand before you as a woman of colour and a Muslim woman. I can experience Islamophobia that is gendered. I can experience sexism and I can experience racism that is gendered. This all has an impact on how policy works for me, on how society works for me. And I am in a privileged position because I'm also educated. Technically, second language is English, and I've had education opportunity. I have financial sustainability. So there's privileges I have, but there's significant inequalities that I face. That's what intersectionality is about. It's simply a way of understanding how power enacts when you have these different dimensions. There's nobody within this room who is simply women. We are different ages, we are different classes, we come from different areas, rural or urban, whatever it might be, so therefore power and policy works for us differently. It has evolved since to talk about other intersections like class and LGBT, socioeconomic status, age, disability, etc. But it's really important that within this we do not forget that it originated as a term to talk about racism and sexism and how that intersects within it. So Women's lived experiences do not exist in silos, so policy making can't exist in silos. If I'm talking about employability as an example, or domestic abuse as another example, if I was not to think about the cultural impact that women face, racism within that, access to opportunity within that, that is a policy that is not fit for purpose. And to give you an example of that, some people are taking photos of this slide, so I'm going to add on a couple of extra sentences so that they can do that. So to give you an understanding of this, whilst you're having these conversations, think about all the intersections that you have within yourself and whether that is thought about in your daily practice. So no matter what part of work you do, whether you are here as a campaigner, when you are doing campaigning activities, are you thinking about intersectionality and who is in the room? Us as a circle, we have to think who is in this room, but most importantly, who is not in this room, who didn't have access to be in this room. As a council, how do we make this room a place that has a real representation of the intersections and that exist within Scotland, the experiences that exist within Scotland, and how are we thinking through an intersectional lens? Have you taken your photos? Excellent. So, to think about this, I want to focus on two recommendations that we made in our last report, because I think this will give a better understanding of what we are asking you in this room today. So one of the first ones was increasing women's representation in politics, and Jane, thank you for talking about what you did. Side note, if you are not signed up to the Women 50/50 campaign, you should be. But we talked about how representation, decisions that are made with a lack of representations mean those decisions are likely to be flawed because lived experience is not around that table when we're making those decisions. So when we talk about increasing the number of women's representation in politics, we've talked about considering legislated candidate quotas, and that has now become a recommendation in the report last year. But it's important that I tell you that no woman of colour has ever been elected to the Scottish Parliament. In the last council elections, the number of women of colour elected decreased from 5 to 4 women, not percentages, 5 to 4 women, okay? Now, if we only pursue status quo intervention and don't think through an intersectional lens, we will open access to women who already had opportunity to pursue politics, okay? We only provide systems, we only create systems, we only create policy that supports, and for want of a better phrase, the lowest hanging fruit. But we need to be looking above in those branches that aren't reaching access to opportunity, to use an extended metaphor. So actually, we need to be thinking about what are we doing to access and eliminate barriers to politics for women with caring responsibilities, working class women, women who are not in employment, because actually it's quite a financial strain to run for elected office. It's a strain on caring responsibilities to run for elected office. It is a strain and an assumption on the level of education you have and how many political acronyms you know to get into political office. The second example I want to give is women experience domestic abuse have sufficient access to expert legal advice and legal aid. It's fundamental, it's absolutely fundamental that we do that. But women living in poverty, migrant women, and women whose second language is English are most likely to be in need of that legal aid. So if we don't think about those intersections, then the intervention that we create might not do the very thing we want it to do. So policy coherence through an intersectional lens is good policy making. So today, all I'm asking is that you think about both gender mainstreaming and policy coherence must be built on intersectional thinking, as I've already said. But in conversation today and always, I want you to think about the ways in which women experiencing multiple discriminations are advantaged or most likely disadvantaged by how we make policy in Scotland right now. How can this be improved? Who gets to have a say? Who doesn't get to have a say, and how are we all going to take responsibility for sharing the platform so the women who don't have the mic usually now get the mic? Thank you very much.